On my 75th birthday, my son gave me a trip to the sea. But in the car, I accidentally heard his call to his wife. Yes, the old woman fell for it. We have a month to sell the house and disappear with the money. When I returned home an hour later, and they saw me. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Eleanor Marsh, and I turned 75 in the September that changed everything. People always said I looked younger than my age. I stood straight, walked without a cane, tended my rose garden every morning before coffee, and still baked my own bread on Sundays. My husband, Gerald, had passed 11 years before, leaving me the house on Maple Street, a white colonial with green shutters that we'd bought together in 1978 for $42,000. The neighborhood appraiser told me last spring it was worth somewhere near $800,000 now. I never thought much about that number. It was just home. It was where I raised my children, buried my dog Biscuit beneath the oak tree in the backyard, and learned to be alone. I had 2 children. My daughter Patricia lived in Portland with her husband and 3 teenagers and called me every Sunday without fail. And then there was my son, Richard. Richard was 51. He was handsome in the way his father had been handsome. Broad shoulders, an easy smile, the kind of face that made strangers trust him immediately. He'd had 2 businesses fail in the last decade, a divorce that cost him considerably, and was currently living in a rented apartment in Riverside with his second wife, Tammy. I hadn't warmed to Tammy. She laughed too loudly at things that weren't funny, and her eyes, when she thought no one was watching, moved around a room the way a person's eyes move when they're calculating something. But Richard was my son. You don't stop loving your children because their choices disappoint you. That's not how it works. The trouble, looking back, I can see it so clearly now, had started about 8 months before my birthday. Richard began calling more often. He came by on weekends, brought Tammy, helped me fix the gutter that had been loose since April. He was attentive in a way he hadn't been since childhood. I told myself he'd simply matured. I told myself that a man in his 50s sometimes looks at his aging mother and feels the pull of responsibility. I should have asked myself, why now? There were small things I filed away without examining. A conversation in March where Richard had asked, quite casually, whether I'd ever thought about a smaller place. Something easier to manage, Mom, at your age. I'd said I managed perfectly well, thank you. He'd smiled and let it go. In May, Tammy had mentioned a friend of hers who worked in real estate, just in passing, nothing more. In July, Richard had asked me whether I'd updated my will recently. I said I had, years ago, and changed the subject. None of it seemed like a pattern. Each thing, alone, was explainable. Then came my birthday. Richard called the week before and told me he'd organized a surprise. A long weekend at a beach house in Santa Barbara that a colleague had lent him. Just you and me, Mom, he said. A birthday trip. You deserve it. I was genuinely moved. I remember thinking perhaps I had been too hard on him in my mind. Perhaps Tammy was just nervous around me. We left on a Friday morning. Richard drove. Tammy stayed home, he said, because she had a work commitment. I sat in the passenger seat with my cardigan and my book, watching the highway unspool in front of us. We stopped for gas about 40 minutes outside of town. Richard got out to fill the tank. His phone, sitting in the cup holder between us, buzzed. I wasn't trying to listen. The car was quiet and his phone was on speaker before I understood what was happening. Tammy's voice came through the line. Not the loud, performed laugh I knew, but a flat, business-like tone I'd never heard from her before. Did she buy it? And Richard's voice, turned slightly away from me, low but perfectly audible. Yeah, she bought it. She's happy. The old girl has no idea. A pause. Then Tammy. Good. So we have the month, right? While she's back and forth, we can get the listing up, get the offers in. My guy says he can move fast if we have the deed situation sorted. Richard. I told you, I'm handling it. We get her signature on the documents before she even realizes what she signed. The trust paperwork is already drafted. Tammy. 1 month, that's all we need. After that, we take the money and we're done. I sat very still. The highway noise outside seemed very far away. I looked at my hands in my lap. The thin skin. The rings I'd worn for 50 years. And I thought, with extraordinary calm, he has planned this. My son has planned this. Richard got back in the car. He handed me a bottle of water. He smiled. Ready to go, Mom? Of course, sweetheart, I said. And I smiled back. But something had locked shut inside me, quiet and cold as a steel door, and I already knew I wasn't going to Santa Barbara. 40 minutes later, I told him I felt unwell. My heart, a pressure in my chest. Nothing too alarming, but perhaps we should turn back. He panicked just enough that I knew his concern for me was not entirely gone. We drove home. He helped me to the door and offered to stay. I told him I just needed rest. He kissed my forehead and left. I stood at the window and watched his car disappear around the corner. Then I went to the kitchen, made myself a cup of strong tea, and sat down at the table to think. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The tea went cold. The light through the window shifted from afternoon gold to the gray-blue of early evening, and still I sat. I wasn't in shock. Not exactly. Shock implies that you couldn't have seen something coming. What I felt was something closer to grief with a hard center, like a peach pit. The soft part of me mourned. The hard part had already begun to think. Let me tell you what I stood to lose, because you need to understand it fully. The house on Maple Street was everything. Not sentimentally, though it was that too, but financially, legally, entirely. Gerald and I had paid off the mortgage in 1999. The deed was in my name. I had no other major assets beyond modest savings, a small pension from my years as a school librarian, and Social Security. The house was my security, my inheritance to my children someday, and the place where I intended to live out the rest of my days among my rose beds and my books and the memory of a life well built. What Richard and Tammy were planning, based on what I had heard, was a fraud. They intended to have me sign documents I didn't understand, likely transferring some form of legal control over the property. With a trust drafted, as Richard had said, and Tammy's real estate contact ready to list the property quickly, they could potentially sell the house and disappear with the proceeds before I understood what had happened. Elder financial fraud. That was the legal term. I had read about it in the newspaper and thought, how terrible those poor families. I had never once imagined I would be sitting in my own kitchen applying those words to myself. Was I certain I had understood correctly? I asked myself this honestly. Yes, I had heard the words. The deed situation. Her signature. We take the money and we're done. There was no innocent interpretation. I had spent 40 years as a school librarian, which meant I had spent 40 years teaching children the difference between what a text says and what you wish it said. I knew what I had heard. Could I confront Richard directly? The thought arrived and I examined it like a damaged book. Carefully, without rushing. No, not yet. If I confronted him now, he would deny everything. Tammy would deny everything. They would call me confused, emotional, misremembering. They would perhaps accelerate their plan, worried that the window was closing, and I had no proof beyond my own account of a conversation I'd heard through a phone speaker. That word, proof, was the thing I needed to build my life around now. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that. I was a 75-year-old woman sitting alone in her kitchen, and I was afraid in a way I hadn't been since Gerald's diagnosis. Not of dying, of being stripped of everything, of being made into a victim of my own child, of spending my remaining years in some managed care situation without resources or recourse, my home gone, my dignity gone, my trust revealed as something that had been exploited. But here is what I also knew about myself. Fear, for me, has always been an engine, not a brake. I got up from the table. I rinsed my teacup. I went to my small desk in the sitting room, the one where I'd always managed the household bills, and I opened the drawer where I kept the documents. My will, drawn up years ago, leaving the house equally to Richard and Patricia. My deed, my trust documents, the ones Gerald and I had established years ago. I read through them methodically, the way I used to read through reference sources, looking for what was there and what was missing. What I found reassured me. The existing documents were sound. Nothing had been changed yet. Richard had said the new trust paperwork was drafted, not signed, which meant they were still waiting for my signature, which meant I still had time. The plan came together slowly, but it came. First, I needed a lawyer, not the family attorney who had drawn up our original will, a man Richard knew, but someone new, someone who owed me nothing and knew none of the players. Second, I needed to make sure the existing deed and trust were protected from modification without my clear consent. Third, I needed to understand exactly what documents they intended to put in front of me and what those documents would do. And fourth, and this was the part that required the most from me, I needed to continue behaving as if I suspected nothing. That last piece was perhaps the hardest thing I'd attempted in my life. It required me to call Richard the following morning and thank him warmly for the trip, to apologize for being unwell, to say I hoped we could reschedule. It required me to send Tammy a small text. "So sorry to ruin the plan, dear. You're both so sweet." It required me to perform the role of an unsuspecting old woman, while, beneath that performance, I moved with quiet and deliberate purpose. I called Patricia that evening, not to tell her everything, not yet, but to hear her voice. And because Patricia, who was a nurse and the more practical of my two children, grounded me in ways she'd never fully know. "You sound tired, Mom," she said. "I am," I told her, "but I'm all right. I'll tell you more soon." After I hung up, I looked up elder law attorneys in my county. There were several. I chose one whose reviews mentioned specifically meticulous, discreet, experienced in family property disputes. Her name was Angela Reyes. I wrote down her number. I would call in the morning. The house was quiet around me. I looked up at the ceiling, the same ceiling I had looked at for 46 years, and I made myself a promise. Not my house, not my signature, not on their terms. Angela Reyes had an office on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, modest and precisely organized, with law books arranged by subject and a small photograph of 2 teenage girls on her desk. She was in her mid-40s, with a manner that was neither warm nor cold, but rather rigorously attentive. The kind of professional who makes you feel that she has heard difficult things before and has not been defeated by any of them. I told her everything. I spoke for nearly 40 minutes without interruption, and she took notes in a narrow, precise hand. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me steadily. "What you've described," she said, "is a textbook elder financial abuse scheme. The combination of social isolation, getting you away from home, document substitution through a fraudulent trust, and the involvement of a third-party real estate contact suggests this has been planned carefully over some time. You did the right thing by coming in before signing anything. Can they be stopped? I asked. They can, but we need to move on two fronts simultaneously. She laid out the plan with brisk efficiency. First, we would file a protective notation on the deed, a legal instrument that would flag any attempt to transfer, encumber, or sell the property without triggering a mandatory review. This would not prevent fraud entirely, but it would make a quick, quiet sale essentially impossible. Second, she would prepare a new estate document, a revocable living trust under my sole control, with Patricia named as the successor trustee. This would formalize my intentions in a way that was legally armored. What about the documents Richard said were already drafted? I asked. She nodded. That's the piece we don't yet have. We know they exist, but we don't know their contents. If we could obtain those documents, or any written communication describing the scheme, that would change your legal position considerably. Evidence. That was the word she used. I turned it over in my mind as I drove home. The protective notation was filed within 48 hours. Angela handled it herself. The new trust documents were drafted and waiting for my signature. From a legal standpoint, I had already neutralized the most dangerous element of their plan. They could not sell the house quickly and quietly. Any transaction would now be flagged. But I wanted more than protection. I wanted documentation. I wanted them to be accountable for what they had tried to do. And so I began, methodically, to gather evidence. I purchased a small digital voice recorder, the kind journalists use, from an electronics store 2 towns over, paying cash. I placed it in the breast pocket of my cardigan whenever Richard was likely to visit. I began saving every text message, printing them out, and filing them in a manila folder. I asked my neighbor, Helen, who had known me for 30 years and who was sharp as a tack despite her bad hip, to note the dates and times whenever Richard's car was parked outside my house. It was Helen, actually, who gave me the first piece of direct documentary evidence. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, 10 days after my meeting with Angela, her voice terse with indignation. Dorothy, that woman, Tammy, she was just parked outside your house for 20 minutes while you were at your appointment. She didn't get out. She sat there on her phone. But I wrote it down, date and time, like you asked, and... Helen paused for effect. I took a photograph. She appeared to be speaking with someone while she was looking at your house. That same week, I accepted Richard's invitation to lunch. We met at a restaurant we'd always liked, a family place near the park. He was relaxed, attentive, solicitous about my health following the aborted trip. Over dessert, he said, carefully, as if the idea had just occurred to him, that he'd been thinking about my finances and whether it might make sense to have a professional review my estate plan. He knew someone, he said, someone very experienced with property trusts. I'm sure I could use the advice, I said pleasantly, and watched something loosen in his posture. He brought up the idea of meeting with this advisor the following week. I agreed warmly. I left the restaurant and drove directly to Angela's office. He's inviting me to a meeting where they'll likely present the fraudulent trust documents, I told her. She smiled for the first time since we'd met. Good. Go. Bring the recorder. Don't sign anything. If they present documents, take them. You're allowed to take them home to review. That's how we get the documentation. The meeting was held in a small office building in an unremarkable business park. Richard's advisor was a man named Gary Ellison, mid-50s, with the smooth confidence of someone who had done this kind of thing before. Tammy was there too, which surprised Richard. He hadn't told me she'd be coming. I saw the flicker in his eyes when she walked in, quickly suppressed. Gary Ellison presented the documents with professional ease. A simplified family trust, he called it, designed to protect my estate from probate delays. The language was designed to be reassuring. But I had spent a week studying trust law with Angela, and I could see exactly what the document did. It transferred managerial control of my property assets to Richard as primary trustee, with a provision that allowed asset liquidation for the beneficiary's care. Care defined by Richard, liquidation proceeding at his discretion. "Could I take these home to review?" I asked pleasantly. Ellison glanced at Richard. A fraction too long. "Of course," he said. I left with the documents in my bag and the recorder running in my pocket. I drove home, hands steady on the wheel, and I thought, now I have them. I had their names, their scheme in writing, their own presentation on tape. There was no going back from this, for any of us. That evening, I sat at my desk and called Angela. "I have everything," I said. There was a brief silence on the line. "Dorothy," she said quietly, "you are a remarkable woman." The plan moved into its next phase the following week. Angela filed a formal complaint with the County Adult Protective Services Division, attaching a written account of the scheme, copies of the fraudulent trust documents, and a transcript, which she had prepared from the recording, of the meeting with Gary Ellison. She also forwarded the relevant materials to a contact at the State Attorney General's office, which handled elder financial abuse cases. The protective notation on the deed had already been in place for 2 weeks. Now there was a formal paper trail. I also did something that felt, in a way, more significant than any legal filing. I called Patricia. I told her everything. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and I talked for over an hour, laying it out from the beginning. The phone call in the car, the aborted trip, the meetings with Angela, the fraudulent documents, all of it. Patricia was silent for a long time after I finished. I could hear her breathing. "Mom," she said finally, "why didn't you call me the moment it happened?" "Because I needed to think," I told her, "and because I needed to handle the first part myself." "Is the house safe?" "Yes, Angela has made certain of that." "And Richard doesn't know any of this yet?" "Not yet," I said. "Soon." Patricia arrived 2 days later, driving 8 hours from Portland without telling me she was coming. She appeared at my door with an overnight bag and red eyes and held me in the hallway for a long moment. We sat up late that night, the two of us at the kitchen table where I had sat alone and afraid 3 weeks before. And we talked the way women talk when everything has become very serious and very clear. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Just stay," I said, "for a while." She stayed. It was on the 4th day of her visit that Richard appeared. He arrived without calling first, which should have told me something. And when he saw Patricia's car in the driveway, he stopped on the front walk. I watched him through the window. He stood very still for a moment, then came up the steps and rang the bell. Patricia answered. She said nothing beyond, "Come in, Richard." We sat in the living room. Richard's eyes moved between us with the careful attention of a man who senses the terrain has shifted, but hasn't yet identified how. He asked how I was feeling. He commented on Patricia's unexpected visit. He smiled the easy smile. Then something changed in his expression. Perhaps it was the way Patricia was looking at him. Perhaps it was simply that he was, beneath everything, not a stupid man. "What's going on?" he said. I told him we knew. I didn't say it dramatically. I said it the way you'd read aloud a fact from a reference book. Calmly, precisely. I said that I had been present in the car and had heard his call with Tammy. I said that I had consulted an attorney. I said that the deed had been legally protected and that formal complaints had been filed. The easy smile disappeared. What replaced it was not remorse. It was something colder. "You don't understand," he said. "You're 75 years old. You can't manage this house forever. We were trying to help you transition." "Richard," Patricia said quietly, "stop." He stopped. Then he tried a different approach, his voice softening, the old warmth returning like a practiced instrument. He said I was misunderstanding the documents. He said Gary Ellison was a legitimate professional. He said Tammy was only trying to help. When that didn't work, he stood up, and the warmth went away completely. "You're making a mistake," he said. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "I believe I do," I said. He left. The front door closed harder than necessary. Patricia and I sat in the quiet living room. The afternoon light came through the curtains. Outside, my roses were still blooming along the fence. "He'll be back," Patricia said. "I know," I told her. We were both right. But they didn't come back immediately. They retreated, the way people retreat when they've miscalculated and need to reassess. Angela informed me the following week that Gary Ellison had retained a lawyer and was claiming the trust documents were a standard instrument misrepresented to the client. Richard had not yet been formally interviewed by Adult Protective Services, but they had opened a case file. I was tired, not defeated. Tired in the way of someone who has been running on alertness and adrenaline and needs, briefly, to simply rest. I put some of Patricia's tomato soup on the stove that evening, and we ate at the kitchen table and watched an old film on television, and I let myself breathe. For a few days at least, I let myself simply breathe. Tammy called on a Wednesday morning. Patricia had gone out to pick up groceries, and the house was quiet in that soft mid-morning way. The kind of quiet where you can hear the clock and the birds and nothing else. I saw Tammy's name on my phone screen, and I let it ring twice before I answered, giving myself just that much time to set my expression, though she couldn't see my face. "Dorothy." Her voice was different again. Not the performing laugh, not the flat business-like tone from the car, but something carefully constructed, something meant to sound sincere. I just wanted to call and say, "I know things have gotten complicated, and I'm so sorry about that. I really am. This wasn't supposed to happen this way." I said nothing. I let the silence sit. "I want you to know," she continued, "that Richard is devastated. He loves you. This whole thing has been blown so far out of proportion. We were only trying to think about your future, about making things easier for you." A pause. "And if there's any way we could just sit down together as a family and clear the air, I think everything could be resolved without all this legal mess." There it was, the offer disguised as an olive branch. "That's very kind of you, Tammy," I said. Another pause. She'd expected more. Either resistance she could push against or softening she could exploit. My calm gave her nothing to work with. "Do you think maybe we could arrange something like that?" she pressed. "I'll certainly give it some thought," I said. We said goodbye. I put the phone face down on the table and sat for a moment. Cold, they might call it. Perhaps. But I had learned, in 75 years, and most pointedly in the last several weeks, that warmth offered to people who mean you harm is not kindness. It's a gift to someone who has already told you they have no intention of deserving it. Was I tempted even slightly by Tammy's call? I examined myself honestly, and the answer was no. Not because I was hard, but because I had heard her voice through a car speaker saying, "We take the money and we're done," and no amount of constructed sincerity could unsay that sentence. I told Angela about the call that afternoon. She said it was exactly what she expected. "They're feeling the pressure from the APS case and Ellison's situation," she told me. "They want you to back down before it goes further." Don't. I had no intention of backing down, but what I did need, and what I was wise enough by 75 to know I needed, was people around me. Not just Patricia, though Patricia was a rock. I needed the wider fabric of my life, the network of relationships I had built over decades to hold me steady. I called Helen first. She came over that same afternoon with a casserole and sat at my kitchen table with the frank, unadorned solidarity of an old friend who has seen trouble before and does not flinch. I told her more than I had before, not every legal detail, but the shape of the thing. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "Dorothy, I have known you for 30 years. If you tell me the sky is green, I will look up and consider it seriously." She patted my hand. "You know what you heard. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I also called Father Brennan at the church I had attended for 20 years. Not because I needed spiritual counsel exactly, but because he was a man of 80 with excellent judgment and deep roots in the community. And he had served on the County Elder Advocacy Board for a decade. He listened carefully, asked 3 precise questions, and then told me there was a local support group for seniors navigating family financial disputes. He'd put me in touch with the coordinator. I went the following Thursday. The meeting was held in the fellowship hall of a Lutheran church on the far side of town. A circle of folding chairs, a coffee urn, 8 or 9 people of various ages. 2 of them were seniors like me. The others were adult children or caregivers navigating similar crises from different directions. A woman named Carol, perhaps my age, had lost her savings to a nephew she'd trusted. A man named Bernard had caught his stepchildren filing forged paperwork on a property he'd owned for 40 years. I listened more than I spoke that first evening. But the listening itself was restorative. This was the thing about being 75 and in the middle of a crisis. The loneliness of it could be almost paralyzing. The sense that you are somehow unusual, that this does not happen to careful, sensible people, that you should have seen it sooner. Sitting in that circle, I understood that what was happening to me was neither unique nor the result of foolishness. It was terribly common. Driving home in the dark, I felt something I hadn't felt since the afternoon in the car. Settled. Not happy, not unafraid, but settled. In possession of myself. I had my lawyer. I had Patricia. I had Helen. I had Father Brennan and Carol and Bernard and the folding chairs and the coffee urn. I had the protective notation on the deed. I had the recording and the documents. And I had, underneath all of it, the absolute bedrock conviction that what I was doing was right. That conviction, I had learned, was not something anyone could take from me. Not Tammy with her careful voice, not Richard with his easy smile. Not anyone. They came on a Sunday. I had been in the garden that morning, tending the roses that grew along the south fence. The climbers Gerald had planted in our first year, which still bloomed in September, as reliably as anything I'd ever known. Patricia had gone to the farmer's market, 2 streets over. The morning was cool and bright, and I was deadheading the spent blooms with my small shears when I heard the car in the driveway, Richard and Tammy. Together this time, which was deliberate. I understood that immediately. When they arrived together, it meant they had discussed this, planned this approach, decided that a joint appearance would carry more weight. Richard in a blue jacket I recognized from family holidays. Tammy in a cream-colored blouse, tasteful, non-threatening, both of them wearing expressions calibrated to project remorse. I set down my shears on the garden wall, slowly, and took a breath. The roses smelled of something clean and indifferent. I was glad of that. Mom. Richard came around the gate and stopped a few feet from me. "I know we shouldn't just show up, but I didn't think you'd agree to see us if I asked. And I needed to talk to you." I took off my gardening gloves and held them in one hand. "Come inside," I said. We sat in the living room. Tammy had brought flowers, white daisies, a modest, careful choice. She set them on the coffee table with a small, practiced smile, and for a moment, the three of us looked at them as though they were the central fact of the situation. They were not, of course. They were a prop. I had spent 40 years teaching children to distinguish between what a text meant and what it wished to mean. And a bunch of daisies from a woman who had said, "The old girl has no idea," was a text I could read perfectly well, Richard began. He spoke for several minutes without significant interruption, and he was good at it. I had always known he had his father's capacity for persuasion, though Gerald had used that gift honestly. Richard spoke about his own financial pressures, not as excuses, but as context. The failed businesses, the debt he hadn't told me about, the desperation that had driven him toward a plan he acknowledged was wrong. His voice broke once, briefly, at a point that seemed designed for exactly that effect. I watched his face and saw that the emotion was genuine. Not manufactured, but directed. Deployed. He had felt all these things, I believed, and he was using the fact that he had felt them to navigate me toward a particular outcome. That was the difference between feeling something and weaponizing it. "Mom," he said finally, "if you drop the complaint, if we can just keep this in the family, I swear to you, nothing like this will ever happen again. You have my word. I'll get help. I'll deal with the debt another way. Just please, don't do this to our family." Then Tammy spoke. Her performance was more polished than I had expected. She said she took full responsibility, that it had been her idea, that Richard had been pressured into it by her, and she was ashamed. She said this looking directly at me without blinking, in the practiced way of someone who has rehearsed sincerity. She reached forward and put her hand over mine on the armrest and said, "You're his mother. Nothing is worth losing that. Not money, not a house, not any of it." I looked at her hand over mine. I thought about the voice through the car speaker. Flat, efficient, utterly certain, saying, "We take the money, and we're done." And I thought, this woman is not ashamed. She is afraid. Those are very different things, and I am no longer confused about which is which. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. Richard took a breath. "So you'll think about withdrawing from the process?" And there it was, the real sentence. Everything else had been the path cleared and leveled to deliver this precise question. Drop the complaint. Keep it in the family. Trust them again. Become, once more, the old girl who had no idea. Was I tempted? Even the smallest bit? I will tell you honestly, there was a part of me. The part that had held Richard as an infant, that remembered the gap-toothed smile at 7, the way he'd clutched Gerald's hand in the hospital hallway and wept without sound, that ached with the weight of this moment. Not because I believed him, but because he was my son, and I was his mother, and those words still meant something even in a room like this. The aching was real. I did not pretend otherwise, even to myself. But aching is not the same as yielding. I had learned that slowly over the course of a long life, and I had never been more certain of it than I was now. "Richard," I said quietly, "I love you. I have loved you every day since before you were born. That is not in question, and it will not change." I looked at him steadily, the way I used to look at a student who needed the truth said plainly. "But what you and Tammy planned was not a mistake made in desperation. It was a deliberate scheme, carried out over months against a woman who trusted you completely. The recordings and the documents are already with the attorney and the authorities. I cannot withdraw what has already been submitted and formally documented. And even if I could, I wouldn't. Tammy's hand lifted off mine. Something shifted in her eyes. Not grief, not shame, but calculation. Quickly shuddered. Richard's expression changed. The remorse evaporated. Not slowly, as a genuine feeling fades, but all at once, like a mask removed rather than a feeling abandoned. What replaced it was anger, and I could see that this anger was the truest thing he had shown me since he came through the garden gate. "You're going to regret this," he said. His voice was low, controlled, and harder than anything I'd heard from him before. "You're an old woman living alone. Patricia can't stay forever. And you're going to spend the rest of your years in this house by yourself, with no one, because you chose lawyers over your own family." Tammy stood. "We came here in good faith," she said, the careful voice entirely gone now. "Remember that when you're sitting alone at Christmas." They left without another word. The front door closed, harder this time than before. I heard the car start, and then the sound of it fading down Maple Street. I sat alone in the living room for a long moment. The daisies were still on the coffee table. I thought about putting them in the bin immediately, but I didn't. They were, after all, only flowers, and they had done nothing wrong. I left them where they were. My hands were very still in my lap. I noticed, as though from a slight distance, that I was afraid. A quiet, real fear, the kind that lives in the body rather than the mind. An old woman, living alone. He had said it as a threat, but it had landed somewhere deeper than a threat, in the place where the real vulnerabilities live. I was 75. Patricia had a life in Portland. The house was large and the winters were quiet. And then, gradually, the fear transmuted. Because Richard was right that I had made a choice. But the choice had not been lawyers over family. He had made that framing, and I refused it. The choice I had made was self-respect over victimhood. Truth over the comfort of pretending. The right to remain in my own home, the person I had spent a lifetime becoming. That, I decided, was worth being alone for. I picked up my phone and texted Patricia. "They came. I'm fine. Come home when you're ready." Then I went back to the garden and finished deadheading the roses. The formal meeting was Angela's idea. By mid-October, the Adult Protective Services investigation had advanced substantially. A caseworker had interviewed both Richard and Gary Ellison separately, on different days, in different offices, so that neither man could calibrate his account against the others. Ellison had claimed the trust documents were standard instruments. Richard had said substantially the same. Neither of them knew the extent of what I had documented, and that ignorance, that confidence even, was about to cost them considerably. Angela requested a formal resolution meeting, a structured conference with both parties, their legal representation, and an APS case coordinator presiding. Richard's attorney, a defensive and perpetually annoyed man named Morrison, agreed. I suspected he thought the meeting would go in his client's favor. I suspected he had been reassured of this by Richard. Richard's attorney, a defensive and perpetually annoyed man named Morrison, agreed to the meeting. He was, Angela told me afterward, visibly surprised by what he encountered when he arrived. Richard and Tammy would attend. I would attend with Angela. The case coordinator, Ms. Patricia Huang, would preside over the proceedings. The meeting was held in a plain conference room at the APS offices. Fluorescent lighting, a long table, institutional chairs, a water pitcher nobody touched. I arrived 15 minutes early. I wore the gray wool dress I had saved for 15 years, the one I reserved for occasions requiring me to be taken seriously. I carried Gerald's leather document folder and set it on the table in front of me, and I sat with my hands folded and waited. Richard and Tammy arrived with Morrison. Richard was composed. I could see the effort of it, the deliberate steadiness he was maintaining. Tammy had brought her own attorney, a younger woman named Fisher, who'd been retained late in the process. Ellison was not present. His own legal situation had become complicated enough that his attorney had counseled strongly against his participation. Morrison opened with the tone of friendly clarification, as though we were all here to untangle a minor administrative confusion. He characterized the situation as a family matter, involving well-intentioned but poorly communicated estate planning advice. He referenced my age, my loss, my grief, Gerald, long gone, as contributing factors to what he gently called a misinterpretation of good faith efforts. He was fluent and assured, and I could see that he genuinely believed the morning would go his way. Richard spoke next. He had composed himself so thoroughly that he was almost unrecognizable from the man who'd stood in my living room 2 weeks prior, saying, "You're going to regret this." He expressed sorrow. He expressed love. He made no direct admissions, but implied, carefully, that any confusion had been the result of a communication breakdown rather than intent. He was, I thought, very good at this. And the fact that he was so practiced at it told me something about the life he had been living. Tammy said nothing. Fisher had advised silence, and Tammy, whatever else she was, understood strategic instruction. Then Angela presented our case. She was methodical in a way that reminded me of the best reference librarians I'd known, the kind who never raised their voice because they didn't need to, because the materials spoke for themselves. She began with the timeline, the months of incremental approaches, the questions about estate planning introduced casually over meals, the birthday trip designed to place me physically away from the house during what was intended to be a critical window. She presented Helen's dated photographs of Tammy surveilling my property from a parked car. She presented the text messages in which Richard had referenced moving forward with the plan on a date that predated the birthday trip by 6 weeks. She presented the fraudulent trust documents themselves, with annotations showing, provision by provision, how each clause served to transfer effective control of my assets to Richard while appearing on a surface reading to protect me. Then she placed a small speaker on the table and said simply, "I'd like to play a recording." Morrison straightened. "If this is the alleged recording from the vehicle—" "It is," Angela said. "Obtained under single-party consent. Fully admissible under state law." She pressed play. The room was quiet in a particular way. The way a room is quiet when everyone in it has stopped managing their expression and is simply listening. Tammy's voice came through the speaker first, flat and businesslike. Did she buy it? Then Richard's, turned slightly away but perfectly clear. Yeah, she bought it. The old girl has no idea. Then the rest of it. The deed situation, the month they needed, the plan to get my signature before I understood what I'd signed, the plan to take the money and disappear. 38 seconds. I had counted them before. 38 seconds that contained, in their entirety, everything that needed to be known about what had been planned for me in my own home. When it ended, the room was silent. Morrison said immediately and with strained professionalism, "The recording was obtained without—" "Single-party consent applies," Angela said, not raising her voice by a fraction. "My client was physically present in the vehicle. The recording is admissible and has been accepted as such by this office." Morrison fell silent. He looked at Richard, and Richard looked back. And in that exchange, something passed between them. The silent acknowledgement that the ground had shifted beyond recovery. Richard's face had gone a particular gray. Not the red of anger, not the white of shock, but a drained, flattened gray. The color of a man who has understood suddenly and completely that every calculation he made was built on a false premise. He had believed I was an old woman who would not look too carefully at what was placed in front of her. He had believed that love and habit and age would do his work for him. He had been wrong about me for 51 years, and now the error had its full accounting. Tammy was looking at the table. Fisher put a hand on her arm, a professional gesture, not a comforting one. "For the record," Ms. Huang said, her voice even and precise, "I am formally recommending this case be escalated to the District Attorney's Office for review under the state elder financial abuse statutes." She looked at Richard and Tammy with an expression of practiced neutrality that nonetheless communicated, clearly and without ambiguity, that she had reached her own conclusions. The protective notation on the property will remain in effect pending all further proceedings. The estate plan, as modified by the client in consultation with her attorney, will stand as the legally operative document. She closed her folder. Richard stood. He looked at me for the first time since the recording had played, and for a long moment neither of us said anything. There was no easy smile. There was no blue-jacketed charm. There was only my son, 51 years old, standing in fluorescent light, looking at the woman who had loved him from before he existed. I saw something cross his face. Whether it was shame or only the recognition of defeat, I couldn't say with certainty. Perhaps at that particular depth of a person's failure, the two are not so different. "Mom," he said. His voice had lost every instrument, just the word, "bear." "I hope," I said quietly, "that when this is over, you find a way to become the person you were before you made this choice. That person still exists somewhere. I believe that." I picked up Gerald's leather folder. I stood. I walked out. The afternoon light in the parking lot was extraordinarily clean, the kind of clarity that comes after a long tension releases. Angela walked beside me. A car passed on the street. Somewhere nearby, someone was raking leaves, and the sound of it was very ordinary and very good. "It's done," Angela said. "Yes," I told her, "I believe it is." The district attorney's office opened a formal investigation within 3 weeks of the APS referral. Gary Ellison, presented with the evidence and facing serious charges, agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced exposure. He confirmed in a recorded statement that Richard had approached him approximately 7 months before my birthday with an explicit request to structure a trust document that would give Richard effective control over my property without my full understanding of what I was signing. He provided emails, original draft documents prepared at Richard's direction, and records of phone calls. It was, as Angela told me quietly, comprehensive. These emails were, in her word, conclusive. Richard was charged with attempted elder financial fraud and conspiracy, both felonies under state law. Tammy was charged as a co-conspirator. Morrison withdrew from the case. I suspected he had simply seen which way the evidence pointed and decided not to attach his reputation to a losing outcome. Richard's new attorney attempted several motions to exclude the recording. All were denied. The trial took 8 months. I did not attend every session on Angela's advice, but I testified. I sat in the witness box in the gray wool dress and answered questions for nearly 3 hours. When Richard's attorney attempted to characterize me as an elderly woman prone to confusion and misinterpretation, I explained, without raising my voice, the 40 years I had spent as a reference librarian. That you read what is written, not what you wish were written, and that I had applied those same principles to what I heard in that car. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Richard was found guilty on both counts. Tammy was found guilty on the conspiracy charge. Ellison's cooperation had largely sealed the case. His testimony corroborated the recording, the documents, and the broader pattern laid out by the prosecution in methodical and devastating detail. At sentencing, the judge noted the premeditated nature of the scheme and the particular vulnerability of its intended victim. Richard received 3 years of supervised probation, significant fines, and mandatory financial fraud counseling. Tammy received a suspended sentence with probation and community service. Ellison lost his professional license entirely. None of them went to prison. The prosecutor had prepared me for this, and I had made my peace with it. What mattered to me was not that they suffered. It was that they were stopped, that it was documented, that the truth was publicly established, that I was not a victim who could be managed and dismissed. The house on Maple Street was never touched. The deed remained in my name. The protective notation was lifted when proceedings concluded, replaced by the new trust Angela and I had drafted. With Patricia as successor trustee, every provision exactly as I intended. On the day the verdict was read, I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a while. I thought about Gerald, precise, quiet, economical with praise. He would have squeezed my hand and said, "I always knew you could handle yourself, Dot," which would have been enough. I got out of the car. I put the kettle on. I called Patricia. "It's done," I told her. She cried. I didn't, quite, but it was close. The year that followed the verdict was among the best of my life. Not because of what had happened, but because of what had come clear. Simple things revealed themselves as everything that matters. Patricia called every day and brought her family twice that year. Her daughter Nora began calling on her own to ask about library work. Helen and I kept our Thursday coffee. I spoke at a community evening about elder financial fraud. 40 people, 2 of whom called Angela the following week. The kitchen got a fresh coat of pale yellow that Gerald would have objected to and that I loved completely. Richard's conviction ended his career. He did not contact me. Tammy and Richard separated within 6 months. Ellison faced civil suits from 2 additional families. The consequences were real and proportionate. On a warm Saturday in June, I sat in my garden. The roses were extraordinary that year, settled, chosen. I felt a gratitude with no single object. For the call I'd happened to hear, for everyone who helped me, and for the self I had spent 75 years building. Careful, patient, the kind of woman who reads every word before deciding what it means. The roses bloomed. It was more than enough. If you had told me at 74 that the greatest test of my life was still ahead, I wouldn't have believed you. But here is what I know now. Age does not make you safe from betrayal. It can, however, make you wise enough to survive it. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Find your Angela Reyes. Let people help you. And never sign anything you haven't read to the very last word. What would you have done sitting in that car? If this story reached you, share it. Leave a comment. And thank you, sincerely, for listening. You gave this story what every story needs most: a witness.